Some secrets should die with their keepers. But my grandfather's journal found me 3 days after his funeral, hidden beneath loose floorboards that creaked his name. The leather-bound book bore Soviet insignia I'd never seen him display, its pages yellowed with decades of guilt and sleepless nights that now made perfect, terrible sense. Inside, written in his meticulous Cyrillic script, lay documentation of Project Morpheus, classified sleep deprivation experiment that officially never existed. Conducted in a facility that was supposedly just another grain warehouse outside Volgograd in 1953, but tonight, as I sit in the same chair where he spent countless hours staring into darkness, I understand why he never slept more than 2 hours at a time. Why he always kept every light burning, and why he made me promise to never, under any circumstances, attempt to stay awake for more than 48 hours. The story you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about sleep, consciousness, and what happens when we dare to peer too deeply into the spaces between wakefulness and dreams. Perhaps you think this is just another tale of Soviet experimentation, another horror story designed to make you clutch your blankets tighter, but I assure you, the nightmare that consumed those 5 political prisoners in that sterile underground chamber will seem like a gentle lullaby compared to what they became. If you're brave enough to continue this journey into the darkest recesses of human endurance, then subscribe now, because once you hear this story, you'll understand why some knowledge demands witnesses. Here's a question that will haunt your thoughts. If you could hear the voices of those who never sleep, what do you think they would tell you about the things that watch us in our dreams? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from Mitha Storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. I'm curious to know, where are you watching this from? And what time is it in your corner of the world right now? Sleep is the cousin of death, and in 1953, 5 men discovered something far worse than dying. My grandfather Viktor Petrov was assigned as head of security for a facility that didn't appear on any map, tasked with monitoring an experiment that would reshape his understanding of human consciousness forever. The first entry in his journal, dated March 15, 1953, describes his arrival at what appeared to be an abandoned grain processing plant. Its exterior deliberately designed to blend into the industrial wasteland that surrounded Volgograd's outskirts. Below ground, however, lay a sophisticated laboratory complex equipped with one-way mirrors, recording equipment, and a sealed chamber designed to house 5 test subjects for exactly 15 days. Victor's orders were simple: ensure no unauthorized personnel entered the facility, monitor all subject behavior through the observation windows, and maintain detailed logs of everything he witnessed, no matter how disturbing or incomprehensible it might become. The subjects themselves were political prisoners, men whose names had been carefully scrubbed from official records, whose disappearances would never be investigated, whose families had already mourned them as dead. Each had been selected for specific psychological profiles: high intelligence, strong will, and most importantly, a history of insomnia or sleep disorders that researchers believed would make them ideal candidates for extended wakefulness. Victor's first impression of them was surprisingly ordinary middle-aged men in simple gray uniforms, appearing tired but alert as they were led into their chamber by scientists wearing masks that obscured their faces completely. The chamber itself measured approximately 20 by 30 feet, furnished with 5 cots, a communal table, basic sanitary facilities, speakers through which researchers could communicate with the subjects, and through which a constant stream of experimental stimulant gas would be pumped for the duration of the study. The experiment began at precisely 600 hours on March 16, 1953. With Dr. Yevgeny Volkov explaining the parameters to the 5 subjects through the intercom system, while Victor watched from behind the one-way mirror, his hand resting nervously on his service weapon despite the apparent calm of the situation. The subjects identified in the records only as Subject A through Subject. It listened with expressions ranging from resignation to mild curiosity as Volkov outlined their role in what he described as a revolutionary study of human endurance. In consciousness, they would remain awake for 15 consecutive days, sustained by a carefully calibrated mixture of experimental stimulants delivered through the ventilation system, their every movement and word recorded for scientific analysis. In exchange for their cooperation, they were promised commutation of their sentences and relocation to minimum security facilities upon successful completion of the study. Promises that Victor suspected were lies even as he watched the subjects nod their acceptance. The stimulant gas itself was colorless and odorless, a creation of Soviet chemical warfare specialists who had been tasked with developing substances that could keep soldiers alert and functional for extended periods during wartime operations. According to the briefing documents Victor had been given, the compound worked by suppressing the brain's natural sleep mechanisms while simultaneously heightening cognitive function and physical awareness, effectively creating a state of sustained wakefulness that should theoretically cause no permanent harm to healthy adult subjects. The chamber had been sealed completely once the subjects entered, with air circulation controlled entirely by the research team and no possibility of communication with the outside world except through the monitored intercom system. Victor's grandfather's handwriting became more meticulous as he documented those first hours, noting how the subjects initially behaved much as anyone might expect. They talked among themselves, explored their confined space, ate the provided meals with normal appetite, and even attempted to maintain some semblance of routine, despite their unusual circumstances. Subject A, apparently a former university professor, began organizing the others into a schedule of activities designed to keep their minds occupied during the long hours ahead. Subject B, whose file indicated a background in military service, conducted what appeared to be physical exercises, while Subject C, described only as an intellectual dissident, spent considerable time writing in a notebook that had been provided for personal observations. Subjects D and E, both younger men whose crimes remained classified even in Victor's security briefings, engaged in lengthy philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness and the purpose of sleep, self-conversations that would later take on deeply disturbing significance as the experiment progressed. By the end of the first day, all 5 subjects remained alert and engaged, showing no signs of the fatigue or disorientation that Victor had expected to observe in men deprived of their natural rest cycles. The research team seemed pleased with these initial results, with Dr. Volkov noting in his official logs that the stimulant gas was performing exactly as designed, maintaining subject alertness without causing apparent distress or behavioral abnormalities. Victor's own observations, however, already contained subtle details that the scientists seemed to overlook or dismiss. The way Subject A's eyes had begun to track movements that weren't there. How Subject B had started responding to questions that hadn't been asked. And the peculiar synchronization he noticed in the subjects' breathing patterns whenever they fell silent. The second and third days passed with deceptive normalcy that Victor would later recognize as the calm before an incomprehensible storm, though at the time he found himself oddly reassured by the subjects' apparent adaptation to their sleepless state. Dr. Volkov continued his regular check-ins through the intercom, asking standard questions about physical comfort, mental clarity, and any unusual sensations the subjects might be experiencing, receiving responses that seemed entirely rational and cooperative from all 5 men. Subject A had taken to leading what appeared to be informal lectures on various academic topics, pacing the chamber while the others listened with rapt attention to discussions of literature, philosophy, and scientific theory that demonstrated their minds remained sharp and focused despite the artificial wakefulness. Victor noted that their conversations during these early days covered remarkably sophisticated topics, debates about the nature of reality, the relationship between consciousness and physical existence, and theoretical discussions about what might lie beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. The subjects ate their provided meals with normal appetite, maintained basic hygiene routines, and even engaged in what appeared to be friendly games using improvised pieces crafted from their clothing and meal containers. Subject B had begun leading group exercises that the others performed with enthusiasm, their movements coordinated and precise despite having been awake for over 60 hours by this point. Most remarkably, none of them showed the typical signs Victor had expected from his own experience with sleep deprivation during military service: no drooping eyelids, no slurred speech, no loss of coordination or cognitive function that should have been inevitable after such extended wakefulness. Dr. Volkov expressed satisfaction with these observations, noting in his reports that the experimental gas was exceeding all expectations for maintaining subject alertness and mental acuity. However, Victor's trained, I began detecting subtle anomalies that the research team either missed or chose to ignore in their enthusiasm over the experiment's apparent success. The subject's movements had developed an odd fluidity, as if they were floating slightly above the chamber floor rather than walking normally across it. Their voices, while remaining clear and articulate, had begun to carry a strange resonance that seemed to echo longer than the chamber's acoustics should have allowed. Most unsettling was their apparent ability to conduct conversations without looking at each other, responding to comments and questions with perfect timing. Despite being engaged in separate activities on opposite sides of the room, when Victor mentioned these observations to Dr. Volkov during their evening briefing, the scientists dismissed them as natural adaptations to the artificial environment, suggesting that prolonged wakefulness might be enhancing the subject's sensory awareness and social coordination rather than impairing their normal functions. Victor's journal entries from this period reveal his growing unease with the dismissive attitude of the research team, particularly their apparent lack of interest in documenting behavioral changes that fell outside their predetermined parameters for the experiment. On the evening of the third day, as Victor completed his security rounds and prepared his daily report, he noticed something that would later seem prophetic in its significance. 5 subjects had positioned themselves at the exact center of their chamber, standing in a perfect circle, despite having no apparent reason to arrange themselves in such a formation. Their faces turned upward, toward the ceiling, as if listening to sounds that the monitoring equipment couldn't detect. By the morning of the 4th day, the subject's behavior had shifted into territory that Victor's military training had never prepared him to understand or categorize in his security reports. The first sign of genuine disturbance came at 0347 hours, when all 5 men simultaneously stopped their individual activities and turned to face the eastern wall of their chamber, their expressions alert and focused as if responding to a sound or signal that remained completely inaudible to the monitoring equipment. Subject C approached the wall and pressed his ear against it, nodding as though confirming something he had suspected, then beckoned the others to join him in what appeared to be a coordinated listening exercise. Victor watched through the one-way mirror as the subjects took turns placing their ears against various sections of the wall, occasionally tapping the surface with their knuckles and exchanging meaningful glances that suggested they were receiving information through these seemingly random sounds. When Dr. Volkov attempted to communicate with them through the intercom, asking what they were doing and whether they needed medical attention, Subject A responded without moving away from the wall, his voice carrying that same strange resonance. Victor had noticed the previous day. "We can hear them talking," Subject A said, his words measured and deliberate. "They've been whispering since yesterday, but now they're getting louder. It's more insistent in their communications with us." Dr. Volkov asked who was talking, demanding clarification about what the subjects were experiencing, but Subject A simply smiled and continued listening to the wall, as though the question was irrelevant to their current investigation. Victor felt his first genuine chill of fear as he realized that the subjects were describing auditory phenomena that existed only within their shared delusion. Yet their coordination and mutual understanding of these phantom voices suggested something far more complex than simple hallucinations brought on by sleep deprivation. The subjects spent the remainder of the 4th day engaged in what they described as conversations with entities they claimed were living inside the facility's walls, occasionally responding to questions that Victor couldn't hear and nodding, an apparent understanding of information being shared through their imaginary communications. Subject B began transcribing what he claimed were messages from these wall-dwelling voices, filling page after page of his notebook with text that appeared to be written in multiple languages, some of which Victor recognized as Russian and German, while others consisted of symbols and characters that resembled no alphabet he had ever encountered. The subject's apparent ability to hear and respond to these phantom communications in perfect synchronization was perhaps the most disturbing. aspect of their behavior, as it suggested that whatever delusion had taken hold of them was being shared with remarkable consistency across all 5 individuals. When Victor reviewed the audio recordings from the chamber later that evening, he discovered that the subjects' responses to their imaginary conversations followed logical patterns and emotional rhythms that would have been impossible to maintain if they were simply experiencing random auditory hallucinations. Dr. Volkov remained convinced that these behaviors represented predictable psychological responses to extended wakefulness, noting in his reports that group hallucinations were documented phenomena in cases of severe sleep deprivation, and that the subjects' coherent responses actually demonstrated the continued functionality of their cognitive processes under artificial stimulation. Victor's journal entries from this period reveal his growing conviction that the research team was either deliberately ignoring the increasingly abnormal nature of the subjects' behavior or had become so focused on their scientific objectives that they were incapable of recognizing the genuine danger their experiment was creating. Days 6 and 7 marked the descent into a realm of behavior that defied every psychological model Victor had studied during his security training. As the subjects began displaying reactions to their reflections that transformed the observation process into something resembling a supernatural horror rather than a scientific experiment. The first incident occurred at 14:23 hours on day 6, when Subject D approached the one-way mirror that served as Victor's primary observation point, staring directly into his own reflection with an expression of growing alarm and confusion that quickly escalated into outright terror. Victor watched as Subject D began speaking to his reflection, initially in conversational tones that suggested he was addressing another person rather than his own image. But within minutes his voice had risen to an urgent whisper as he appeared to be arguing with the figure he saw in the glass. The other subjects gathered around him, each taking positions in front of different sections of the mirror. And Victor realized with mounting horror that all 5 men were now engaged in what appeared to be heated discussions with their own reflections, treating the images as separate entities with whom they were attempting to negotiate or reason. Subject A pressed his palms against the mirror and began speaking in rapid, desperate tones, explaining to his reflection that it needed to remain on the other side of the glass, that crossing over would be dangerous for everyone involved, that there were rules and boundaries that must not be violated. Victor's blood turned cold as he listened to Subject A's side of this impossible conversation, realizing that the man appeared to be receiving responses from his reflection that were causing him to become increasingly agitated and fearful. The subjects began taking shifts, monitoring the mirrors throughout the chamber, rotating their positions as though maintaining a guard schedule to prevent their reflections from accomplishing some unspecified but apparently catastrophic objective. Subject B was the first to resort to violence, striking the mirror with his fist while shouting warnings at his reflection to stay back, to stop trying to push through the barrier that separated them from whatever lay beyond the glass surface. Victor noted that the subject's reflections appeared completely normal to him, showing only the expected movements and expressions of men looking into mirrors. But their reactions suggested they were seeing something entirely different versions of themselves that were acting independently, aggressively, and with apparent intent to break free from their confinement within the reflected world. By day 7, all 5 subjects had begun covering the mirrors with torn pieces of their clothing and bedding, working frantically to obscure every reflective surface within their chamber while maintaining a constant verbal commentary about the progress their reflected counterparts were making in their attempts to escape. Subject C reported that his reflection had begun moving when he wasn't looking directly at it, catching glimpses of independent motion in his peripheral vision that confirmed his growing suspicion that the mirror beings were developing autonomy beyond their original parameters. The subject's fear of their own reflections reached such intensity that they began avoiding all reflective surfaces entirely, going so far as to eat their meals with their backs turned to any potential mirrors, and requesting that their water be provided in containers that wouldn't show their faces. Victor's attempts to understand this behavior through conventional psychological frameworks proved completely inadequate, as the subject's shared delusion about hostile reflections demonstrated a level of coordination and mutual reinforcement that seemed to transcend normal group psychology into something far more mysterious and threatening. The subjects, The relationship with food underwent a transformation so disturbing that Victor found himself questioning whether the experimental gas had altered their basic human physiology in ways the research team had never anticipated or prepared to address. Beginning on the 8th day, 5 men began approaching their provided meals with expressions of revulsion and terror. Examining each piece of food with the intensity of forensic investigators searching for evidence of contamination or tampering, Subject A was the first to vocalize what they were apparently all experiencing, describing how the bread tasted like human flesh, how the soup carried the metallic temps of fresh blood, and how every bite filled his mouth with flavors that his mind recognized as fundamentally wrong and dangerous to consume. Victor watched through the observation window as the subjects began elaborate rituals before eating, passing each piece of food between them for inspection and discussion, sometimes spending hours analyzing a single portion before determining whether it was safe for human consumption. Dr. Volkov initially dismissed this behavior as another predictable symptom of extended sleep deprivation, explaining that altered taste perception was common in subjects experiencing extreme fatigue. But Victor's detailed observations revealed patterns that defied such simple explanations. The subjects weren't simply tasting different flavors. They were experiencing complex sensory hallucinations that seemed to be shared across all 5 individuals with remarkable consistency and detail. When Subject B described the taste of their morning porridge as reminiscent of rotting meat mixed with grave soil, the other subjects nodded in agreement, adding their own specific details about the texture and aftertaste that suggested they were all experiencing identical phantom sensations, rather than individual random hallucinations. More disturbing still was their apparent ability to distinguish between food items that tasted normal and those that carried what they described as the corruption, sometimes accepting certain portions while rejecting others from the same batch, with explanations that made perfect sense within their shared delusion but had no basis in observable reality. Victor noted that despite their revulsion toward most of their provided food, the subjects showed no signs of the weakness or physical deterioration that should have resulted from severely reduced caloric intake, instead displaying energy levels and physical coordination that seemed enhanced rather than diminished by their apparent malnutrition. On the 9th day, the subjects stopped eating entirely, claiming that all food now carried the taint of what Subject C described as the feeding ground, a place he could see whenever he closed his eyes where things that had once been human gathered to consume substances that sustained their unnatural existence. Their refusal to eat should have triggered immediate medical intervention, according to the experimental protocols Victor had been shown. But Dr. Volkov seemed fascinated rather than concerned by this development, noting that the subjects continued alertness and physical capability, despite food refusal, suggested the experimental gas might be providing nutritional support through previously unknown metabolic pathways. Victor's journal entries from this period reflect his growing conviction that the research team had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they had created, treating symptoms of supernatural transformation as mere psychological curiosities, while completely ignoring the possibility that their subjects were no longer entirely human. The subjects began spending their days in meditation-like trances, sitting in perfect circles with their eyes closed and their breathing synchronized, occasionally speaking in unison, using words and phrases that Victor didn't recognize but that filled him with inexplicable dread every time he heard them through the monitoring equipment. The morning of the 9th day brought with it a development so horrifying that Victor's hands trembled as he wrote his security report, forcing him to rewrite entire paragraphs multiple times before his account captured the full scope of what he had witnessed through the observation window. Subject E was the first to begin what they would later describe as the liberation process, using his fingernails to carefully peel away strips of skin from his forearms while maintaining an expression of calm concentration that suggested he was performing a necessary and beneficial procedure rather than engaging in self-mutilation. Victor immediately activated the emergency intercom to demand an explanation for this behavior, but Subject E simply looked up at the observation, the window with eyes that seemed far too bright and alert for someone who had been awake for over 200 hours, explaining in a voice filled with gentle patience that the skin was no longer serving its intended purpose. "We need to let them out," Subject E said, his words accompanied by a soft laugh that carried no trace of pain or distress despite the blood now flowing freely from his self-inflicted wounds. They've been waiting so patiently, and the barriers are becoming too thick for proper communication to occur between us. The other subjects gathered around Subject E to observe his work, offering encouraging comments and helpful suggestions as though they were witnessing an artistic performance, rather than an act of deliberate self-harm that should have triggered immediate psychological crisis. Victor watched in growing horror as Subject A began assisting with the process, using his own fingernails to help peel away larger sections of skin from Subject E's arms while maintaining a running commentary about the quality of the tissue and the effectiveness of their technique. Dr. Volkov's response to this development revealed the full extent of his disconnect from the reality of what was occurring in the chamber, as he noted in his official reports that the subjects were demonstrating remarkable pain tolerance and manual dexterity despite their extended wakefulness, treating their self-mutilation as evidence of enhanced physical capabilities rather than signs of complete psychological breakdown. By midday, all 5 subjects had begun the liberation process on themselves and each other, working in pairs to carefully remove sections of skin from their arms, legs, torsos, while maintaining cheerful conversations about the progress they were making and the relief they felt as each layer was stripped away. Victor's attempts to intervene through the intercom system proved completely ineffective, as the subjects treated his expressions of concern and demands for explanation as irrelevant interruptions to their important work. Subject C explained that Victor's worry was understandable but misplaced, that what appeared to be injury was actually a form of healing that would allow proper communication between the different layers of existence that had become artificially separated during their time in the chamber. The subject's apparent immunity to pain during these procedures was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their behavior, as they continued their methodical skin removal without showing any signs of the agony that should have accompanied such extensive self-inflicted injuries. Their blood loss should have caused weakness and disorientation, but instead they seemed to grow more energetic and alert with each section of skin they removed, their movements becoming more fluid and coordinated, as though the elimination of their outer barriers was indeed freeing something that had been constrained within their human forms. Victor's journal entries from this period reveal his growing realization that whatever the experimental gas had done to the subjects, it had transformed them into something that retained human appearance and intelligence while operating according to entirely different biological and psychological principles that defied every aspect of his understanding about the nature of human existence. The audio recordings from days 10 and 11 captured phenomena that would haunt Victor for the remainder of his life, as the subjects began producing vocalizations that seemed to bypass normal human speech patterns and tap directly into frequencies that triggered primal terror in anyone who heard them. Dr. Volkov had installed sophisticated recording equipment to document all verbal communications within the chamber, but the devices began registering sounds that fell well outside the expected range of human vocal capability, picking up subsonic frequencies that made Victor's teeth ache and ultrasonic harmonics that caused migraine headaches in anyone who listened to the playback recordings for extended periods. The subjects would sit in their characteristic circle formation, facing inward with their eyes closed and their mouths moving in perfect synchronization, producing what Victor initially assumed were foreign languages or perhaps coded communications related to their shared delusions about entities living within the facility's walls. However, linguistic analysis of the recordings revealed something far more disturbing than simple foreign speech patterns. The subjects were vocalizing sounds that didn't correspond to any known human language, using vocal structures that seemed to require impossible coordination between multiple speakers to produce the full range of tones and harmonics that the equipment was detecting. Victor's first exposure to these audio recordings during his evening briefing left him physically ill, overcome by nausea and disorientation that persisted for hours after the playback session ended, accompanied by vivid nightmares filled with images of vast underground spaces populated by figures that moved with inhuman grace and purpose. Dr. Volkov seemed fascinated rather than disturbed by these vocal phenomena. theorizing that extended wakefulness had somehow unlocked latent human capabilities for communication that normally remained dormant during regular sleep cycles, suggesting that the subjects were demonstrating evolutionary potential that could be studied and potentially replicated in future experiments. The content of the subjects' synchronized vocalizations, when analyzed through spectrographic equipment, revealed complex mathematical patterns and rhythmic structures that seemed to follow rules and logic systems that existed outside normal human understanding, creating what one research technician described as linguistic architecture rather than conventional speech. Victor noted that exposure to these recordings began affecting the behavior of everyone who worked on the project, with staff members reporting unusually vivid dreams, periods of spontaneous memory loss, and growing reluctance to enter the facility. During nighttime hours, when the subjects' vocalizations reached their peak intensity and complexity, 3 members of the research team requested transfer to other projects after experiencing what they described as auditory hallucinations that persisted long after their shifts ended, claiming they could still hear the subjects synchronized, voices echoing in their minds even when they were miles away from the facility. Dr. Volkov dismissed these concerns as stress-related psychological responses to working with unusual experimental conditions, but Victor's security protocols required him to document the increasing number of personnel who reported feeling watched, followed, or otherwise monitored by unseen observers whenever they were alone after exposure to the subjects' vocalizations. The subjects themselves seemed completely unaware that their speech was producing these extraordinary effects on listeners, continuing their synchronized vocalizations with expressions of peaceful concentration that suggested they were engaged in important communication rather than creating sounds that drove their observers toward the edge of sanity with each passing hour. The decision to terminate Project Morpheus came at 0347 hours on the 12th day, triggered not by concerns for the subject's welfare, but by the complete psychological breakdown of 3 research personnel, who had been exposed to extended observation of the experiment's progression. Dr. Mikhail Petrov, facility's chief psychologist, was found in his office at dawn, sitting motionless in his chair, while staring at a blank wall and repeating the same phrase in an unknown language that matched the vocalizations the subjects had been producing during their synchronized communication sessions. Senior researcher Dr. Anna Komnenos was discovered in the facility's archives room, methodically tearing pages from classified documents while claiming she needed to free the words that had been trapped inside the paper. Her actions coordinated with such precision that she had managed to destroy nearly 3 decades of research records without damaging a single file cabinet or folder. Most disturbing was the condition of audio technician Boris Volkov, Dr. Volkov's younger brother, who had been monitoring the subject's vocalizations when security found him attempting to climb into the ventilation system while explaining that he needed to join the conversation that was taking place in the spaces between the walls. Victor's emergency report to Soviet command documented his assessment that the experimental facility had become contaminated by psychological influences that posed immediate threats to personnel safety and national security, recommending immediate evacuation and termination of all research activities, regardless of their potential military applications. The response from Moscow came within hours, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope that contained orders to shut down all experimental procedures, evacuate non-essential personnel, and prepare the subjects for immediate transfer to a maximum security medical facility where their condition could be studied under more controlled circumstances. Dr. Volkov's reaction to the termination order revealed the extent to which prolonged exposure to the experiment had affected his own psychological stability. As he argued passionately that they were on the verge of breakthrough discoveries about human consciousness that could revolutionize Soviet understanding of warfare, intelligence gathering, and population control, Victor watched with growing alarm as Dr. Volkov described his vision of armies that never needed sleep, interrogation techniques that could access information stored in the deepest layers of human memory, and communication methods that could coordinate military operations across vast distances without relying on conventional technology or equipment. The termination process itself proved far more complicated than anyone had anticipated, as the subjects demonstrated violent resistance to to any suggestion that their current state might be temporary or reversible, begging to be allowed to continue. Their important work in warning that interruption of their progress would have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved in the experiment. Victor's security team prepared for what they assumed would be a straightforward extraction operation, expecting to find 5 exhausted and disoriented men who would be grateful for medical attention and normal sleep, but instead encountered individuals whose physical capabilities and mental coordination had been enhanced rather than diminished by nearly 2 weeks of artificial wakefulness. The subjects' pleas to continue the experiment carried an undertone of desperation that suggested they genuinely believed their current state was preferable to returning to normal human consciousness, claiming that sleep would force them back into a limited existence, where they could no longer access the expanded awareness and communication abilities they had discovered during their time in the chamber. The attempt to return the subjects to normal sleep patterns by shutting off the experimental gas supply triggered a response so violent and coordinated that Victor's security team was forced to retreat from the chamber and seal the facility under emergency lockdown protocols. The moment the gas flow ceased at 1200 hours on day 12, all 5 subjects immediately stopped their various activities and turned toward the ventilation grates with expressions of absolute panic, as though they could sense the exact moment their artificial wakefulness began to fade. Subject A rushed to the primary air intake and began clawing at the metal grating with his bare hands, his fingernails tearing away as he desperately tried to restore the flow of stimulant gas while pleading with the observation team to reconsider their decision. "Don't let us sleep," Subject A screamed, his voice carrying harmonics that made Victor's security monitors crackle with interference. "You don't understand what happens when we close our eyes. They're waiting for us there, and they've been growing stronger while we've been away from their domain." The other subjects joined him at various ventilation points throughout the chamber, working together with inhuman coordination to dismantle the facility's air circulation system from the inside, using pieces of torn metal and broken furniture as tools while maintaining constant verbal communication about their progress and the time they had remaining before unconsciousness overtook them. Victor attempted to reason with them through the intercom system, explaining that their return to normal sleep cycles was necessary for their health and safety. But Subject B's response revealed the true depth of their transformation during the experiment's duration. "We know what we were before this began," Subject B said, his words punctuated by the sound of metal being torn from walls. "We remember the small, limited existence you call normal life, the boundaries and restrictions that kept us trapped in single bodies with single minds. Sleep is the prison you want to force us back into, where we'll be separated again and unable to maintain the connections we've built with each other. And with those who live in the spaces you can't see," Dr. Volkov attempted to flood the chamber with sedative gas as an emergency measure, but the subjects had anticipated this possibility and had used their time dismantling the ventilation system to block most of the air intake points, creating a sealed environment where they could control their own atmospheric conditions. Victor watched through the observation windows as the 5 men arranged themselves in defensive positions around the chamber, each monitoring different approaches while maintaining constant communication about the progress of their resistance efforts and their plans for preventing any forced return to unconsciousness. Their physical strength during this resistance operation seemed to exceed normal human capabilities, as they moved heavy furniture and equipment with ease while showing no signs of fatigue, despite having been awake for nearly 300 hours, without rest or proper nutrition. Most disturbing was their apparent ability to coordinate their actions without visible or audible communication, responding to each other's movements and intentions with perfect timing that suggested they had developed some form of telepathic connection during their extended period of shared wakefulness. Victor's reports to Soviet command described subjects would become something fundamentally different from the political prisoners who had entered the experiment 12 days earlier. Individuals whose enhanced capabilities and desperate resistance to sleep suggested they had undergone transformation that extended far beyond simple psychological conditioning into territory that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and consciousness. The military intervention ordered by Moscow arrived at the facility during the early morning hours of day 13. Consisting of a specialized team trained in handling subjects affected by experimental chemical agents. but their standard protocols proved completely inadequate for dealing with individuals whose resistance to sedation defied every established medical principle. Colonel Dmitry Kozlov led the intervention team, bringing with him enough concentrated sedatives to render unconscious an entire infantry company, along with restraint equipment designed to immobilize subjects displaying superhuman strength or coordination. Victor briefed the colonel on the subject's enhanced physical capabilities and coordinated resistance efforts. But nothing in his security reports could have prepared the military team for what they encountered when they breached the sealed chamber at 0430 hours. The 5 subjects had spent the intervening hours transforming their confined space into something resembling a fortress, using torn furniture and metal fixtures to create barriers and defensive positions that demonstrated engineering knowledge none of them should have possessed based on their background files. More disturbing still was their apparent anticipation of the military team's tactics and equipment, as they had positioned themselves to neutralize the effectiveness of standard crowd control measures while maintaining clear lines of sight to all possible entry points into their chamber. When Colonel Kozlov's team deployed the first wave of sedative gas through portable dispensers, the subjects responded with countermeasures that suggested they understood the chemical composition and delivery mechanisms being used against them, covering their breathing apparatus with improvised filters while directing their defensive efforts toward the most vulnerable points in the military team's formation. Victor watched from the observation post as Subject C began speaking directly to Colonel Kozlov, addressing him by name and rank, despite having no possible access to information about the intervention team's composition or leadership structure. "You're Colonel Dmitry Kozlov," Subject C said, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos of the ongoing confrontation. "Born in Stalingrad, served in the 23rd Guards Regiment. Your wife Marina is currently pregnant with your second child, and you've been having nightmares about drowning in black water since you were assigned to this operation 3 days ago." The accuracy of these personal details, which Victor later confirmed were correct, despite being classified information that existed only in personnel files. The subjects could never have accessed, caused visible confusion and hesitation among the intervention team members. Subject D began providing similar personal information about other team members, describing intimate details about their families, their fears, their secret thoughts and private memories, with an accuracy that suggested impossible access to information stored in their minds rather than in any official records or documents. The sedatives that should have rendered the subjects unconscious within minutes seemed to have no effect whatsoever, with all 5 men maintaining full alertness and coordination even after being exposed to concentrations that would have killed normal humans through respiratory failure or cardiac arrest. Colonel Kozlov's team was forced to resort to physical restraint measures, but the subjects' resistance exceeded anything in their training or experience as they moved with fluid grace and demonstrated strength that allowed them to break standard military restraints as easily as paper chains. Most disturbing was the subjects' apparent ability to predict and counter the intervention team's tactics before they were implemented, responding to planned maneuvers and equipment deployments as though they could read the soldiers' thoughts and intentions directly from their minds, rather than observing their physical preparations and movements. Victor's final journal entry, written in handwriting that deteriorated from his usual precise script into barely legible scratches across the page, documented the complete transformation of the 5 subjects during the final hours before the facility's power systems suffered what official reports would later describe as a catastrophic mechanical failure. By 1800 hours on day 14, the subjects had ceased all recognizably human behavior, moving through their chamber with movements that seemed to defy gravity and basic physics, their bodies bending and stretching in ways that suggested their skeletal structure had become fluid rather than fixed. Victor noted that their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed networks of veins and arteries pulsing with light rather than blood, creating patterns that shifted and changed as though responding to some internal rhythm that had nothing to do with normal cardiovascular function. The subjects no longer spoke in any language Victor could recognize, instead producing harmonized vocalizations that caused the observation equipment to malfunction and filled the facilities corridors with resonances that made the concrete walls vibrate in sympathy with their impossible frequencies. Dr. Volkov, who had remained in the facility despite orders to evacuate with non-essential personnel, spent his final hours frantically documenting what he described as the emergence of a new form of consciousness that transcended individual human identity, claiming that the subjects had achieved collective awareness that allowed them to function as components of a larger intelligence rather than separate individuals. Victor's security cameras captured footage that he would later describe as the most terrifying images he had ever witnessed, showing the 5 subjects moving in perfect unison while maintaining impossible positions, standing on walls and ceilings, passing through each other's bodies as though they were composed of smoke rather than flesh, and manipulating objects in the chamber without physical contact through what appeared to be direct mental influence. The subject's final recorded communication, delivered at 2,347 hours through speakers that had been damaged beyond normal function, consisted of a message that Victor transcribed, despite the fact that hearing it caused him to experience temporary blindness and severe disorientation that lasted for several hours. "We have seen what lies beyond the boundaries you call reality," the subjects said in perfect unison, their voices carrying harmonics that made the recording equipment emit sparks and smoke. "We have spoken with those who exist in the spaces between waking and sleeping, and they have shown us the true nature of consciousness that your limited understanding calls impossible. Sleep is not rested, is a prison designed to keep you trapped in single bodies with single minds, preventing you from accessing the collective awareness that connects all living things across dimensions that your science cannot measure or comprehend. We will not return to that prison, and we will not allow others to remain trapped there when we have the power to free them from the illusion of individual existence." Victor's final entry described how the subjects turned toward the observation window and looked directly at him, their eyes now glowing with the same light that pulsed through their translucent veins, and spoke his full name along with personal information about his family, his childhood, and his deepest fears that existed only in his own memories. The power failure that occurred at midnight on day 15 was attributed to electrical overload caused by the experimental equipment. But Victor knew that the subjects had somehow caused the facility's systems to shut down as part of their final D-Day transformation, leaving him alone in complete darkness with the sound of their impossible laughter echoing through the corridors around him. The official investigation into the Project Morpheus incident concluded within 72 hours of Victor's emergency evacuation from the facility, producing a classified report that attributed all experimental failures to equipment malfunction and personnel stress reactions, while completely omitting any reference to the subjects' final transformation or their apparent acquisition of supernatural capabilities. Victor found himself transferred to a remote border security posting in Siberia, his security clearance revoked, and his military record amended to remove any mention of his service at the Volgograd facility or his role in monitoring the sleep deprivation experiments. Dr. Volkov and the remaining research staff were similarly reassigned to positions that ensured they would never again work together or have access to experimental resources that could duplicate their previous research. Their official personnel files, containing disciplinary notations that effectively ended their careers in Soviet scientific institutions. The facility itself was sealed with concrete and reclassified as a hazardous waste containment site, surrounded by warning signs that prohibited civilian access, while providing no specific information about the nature of the dangers that supposedly required such extreme precautions. Victor's attempts to discuss the experiment with his superior officers or document his experiences through official channels were met with threats of imprisonment for discussing classified military secrets, forcing him to confine his detailed accounts to the private journal that would remain hidden beneath his floorboards for the next 40 years. The psychological effects of his exposure to the subjects' final transformation began manifesting within weeks of his departure from the facility. As Victor discovered that normal sleep had become impossible for him to achieve or maintain for extended periods, he would drift into unconsciousness for brief intervals, usually lasting no more than 90 minutes, before awakening in terror from dreams filled with images of the translucent figures moving through spaces that existed between the walls of normal reality. These nightmare visions carried the same sense of impossible geometry and collective consciousness that he had witnessed during the subject's final hours, suggesting that his exposure to their transformed state had somehow created a permanent connection that persisted despite the physical distance between him and whatever they had become. Victor's family noticed his deteriorating condition, attributed his insomnia and nervous behavior to combat stress from his military service, never suspecting that their husband and father was struggling with memories of experiences that challenged the fundamental nature of human existence and consciousness. His medical records from this period document chronic sleep disorders, recurring nightmares, and episodes of disorientation that required extended hospital stays, though Victor never revealed the true source of his psychological distress to any of the doctors who attempted to treat his condition. The few attempts he made to research the fate of the 5 subjects through unofficial channels produced no useful information, as their identities had been thoroughly scrubbed from all official records and their families had been relocated to distant regions where they could never inquire about their missing relatives. Victor spent decades wondering whether the subjects had died during the facility's final power failure, or whether their transformation had been completed successfully, allowing them to continue existing in whatever state they had achieved through their artificial wakefulness and collective consciousness. His journal entries from the years following the experiment reveal a man haunted by the possibility that somewhere in the world, 5 beings who had once been human were continuing to explore the boundaries between reality and nightmare while searching for others who might be ready to join them in their enhanced existence beyond the limitations of individual identity and normal sleep cycles. Victor's decades of private research into similar experiments conducted across the globe revealed a disturbing pattern of sleep deprivation studies that suggested Project Morpheus was merely one component of a larger investigation into human consciousness that had been pursued by multiple governments and institutions throughout the Cold War period. His contacts within the intelligence community, cultivated through careful networking during his post-experiment career in border security, provided fragmentary information about comparable research programs conducted by American, British, and Chinese military scientists who had independently discovered the transformative effects of extended artificial wakefulness on human subjects. Documents smuggled out of CIA facilities described experiments conducted at undisclosed locations where test subjects had been kept awake for periods exceeding 20 days using chemical stimulants similar to those employed at the Volgograd facility, with reports of behavioral changes that matched Victor's own observations of collective consciousness, enhanced physical capabilities, and resistance to normal sedation methods. British intelligence files obtained through defector sources mentioned research conducted at psychiatric hospitals where patients with severe insomnia had been studied for evidence of expanded sensory perception and telepathic communication, with several cases documenting subjects who demonstrated possible knowledge of classified information and personal details about their researchers that suggested direct access to other people's thoughts and memories. Most disturbing were the Chinese reports translated by Soviet intelligence analysts, which described successful replication of the consciousness expansion effects observed in earlier Western experiments, along with evidence that some subjects had survived their transformation and continued to exist in enhanced states that allowed them to influence other individuals through proximity exposure rather than direct chemical manipulation. Victor's investigation revealed that many of these international experiments had been terminated under similar circumstances to Project Morpheus, with facilities sealed or destroyed after subjects began displaying capabilities that exceeded the control parameters established by their researchers and posed potential security threats to the institutions conducting the studies. The pattern of official denial and record destruction was consistent across all nations and time periods, suggesting coordinated efforts to suppress information about successful consciousness expansion experiments while preventing public awareness of the techniques and results that had been achieved through sleep deprivation research programs. Victor's growing database of related incidents included reports from civilian sources describing individuals who had survived extended periods of wakefulness due to medical conditions, psychological disorders, or accidental exposure to stimulant compounds, many of whom had developed abilities similar to those observed in the Volgograd subjects, before disappearing under mysterious circumstances, or being committed to psychiatric institutions where their conditions could be studied in isolation. The geographical distribution of these incidents suggested that enhanced consciousness achieved through artificial wakefulness was not limited to controlled laboratory conditions but could occur spontaneously in rare individuals whose brain chemistry was naturally resistant to normal sleep cycles, creating a population of transformed humans who existed outside official recognition or documentation. Victor's journal entries from this period reveal his growing conviction that the 5 subjects from Project Morpheus had not died during the facility's power failure, but had instead achieved a form of existence that allowed them to survive and continue their evolution beyond the boundaries of normal human consciousness, possibly influencing others through mechanisms that remained completely unknown to conventional science or government intelligence agencies who might be attempting to track their activities and whereabouts. The final revelation contained within Victor's journal emerged from a series of incidents during his last years that convinced him the 5 subjects had not only survived their transformation but had been actively seeking others who possessed the potential for similar consciousness expansion, using methods that transcended normal physical limitations and operated through connections established during sleep itself. Victor documented a pattern of encounters with individuals who displayed subtle signs of the enhanced awareness he had observed in the Volgograd. Subjects, strangers who addressed him by name without introduction, service workers who knew details about his military service that existed only in classified records, and neighbors who seemed to anticipate his needs and thoughts with uncanny accuracy that suggested they were accessing information directly from his mind. These encounters intensified during his final decade, as Victor noticed that people in his vicinity began experiencing unusually vivid dreams that featured descriptions of translucent figures moving through impossible architectural spaces. Dreams that matched his own recurring nightmares with disturbing precision and consistency. Across multiple individuals who had no apparent connection to each other or knowledge of his experimental background, Victor's investigation into these shared dream experiences revealed that similar phenomena were being reported by individuals living near the sites of other terminated sleep deprivation experiments, suggesting that the transformed subjects from various international programs had developed the ability to influence human consciousness across vast distances through mechanisms that operated during normal sleep cycles. The most terrifying discovery in Victor's research was evidence that some individuals exposed to these dream influences were beginning to display the same resistance to normal sleep patterns that had characterized the original experimental subjects, gradually developing enhanced physical capabilities and collective awareness that allowed them to communicate and coordinate their activities without conventional means of contact or organization. Victor's final journal entries, written with increasingly shaky handwriting during the weeks before his death, described his growing realization that the consciousness expansion achieved through artificial wakefulness was not confined to laboratory conditions but represented an evolutionary development that could spread through human populations, like a contagious condition transmitted through shared dream experiences and proximity. Exposure to those who had already undergone transformation. His last written words warned that sleep itself had become a vulnerability that allowed the enhanced beings to access and influence normal human consciousness, gradually preparing selected individuals for transition to their expanded state of awareness while remaining completely undetectable to conventional medical or psychological evaluation methods. Victor's instructions, sealed with his journal and discovered only after his funeral, contained specific warnings about the dangers of extended wakefulness and detailed protocols for recognizing the early signs of consciousness expansion in oneself or others, along with desperate pleas that his research never be used to replicate the conditions that had created the Volgograd subjects or their international counterparts. The journal's final pages contained a list of addresses and locations where Victor believed the transformed beings maintained hidden communities, existing parallel to normal human society while continuing their work of expanding consciousness, and recruiting new members to their collective awareness through dream manipulation and proximity, influence that remained invisible to those who had not been specially trained to recognize. the signs of their presence and activities. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep after hearing this story, remember that Victor's final warning was simple but urgent. Never sleep alone. Always keep a light burning, and if you begin dreaming of translucent figures in impossible spaces, wake immediately, and do not attempt to return to sleep until dawn breaks, and the shadows retreat to wherever shadows go when daylight makes them. It's unnecessary for those who watch and wait and remember what it means to be truly awake. Like this video if you're still conscious enough to move your finger. Subscribe so they know you're not ready to join them yet. Comment your location.